1965. Although here, in the Vorkuta Gulag, the very concept of time was distorted, stretched into an endless gray thread of suffering, where one day was indistinguishable from another. For Alexei Petrovich Voronov, prisoner number 732, this was the 7th year of his 15-year sentence. 7 years or 2,555 days, to be precise. He counted every damn day, every strike of the pickaxe against the unyielding coal seam, every breath of icy air infused with dust and despair. He was 38 years old, but a mirror, if one existed here, would reflect an old man. Deep wrinkles furrowed his forehead, and in his once lively and clear eyes, eternal permafrost had frozen, just like the one that bound the earth for hundreds of kilometers around. Alexei, a former bridge-building engineer from Leningrad, ended up here under Article 58, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. An imprudent phrase among colleagues, a denunciation from an envious coworker, and here he was, the builder of bridges, hacking away at coal seams in the bowels of the earth beyond the Arctic Circle. Every descent into the mine was a plunge into hell. The air, thick and heavy, smelled of dampness, rotting wooden supports, and the sharp, acrid scent of methane. The dim light of the miners' lamps snatched from the darkness only small patches of black, glistening rock, the exhausted faces of fellow sufferers, and the ever-watchful figures of the guards. The work was penal labor. The quota, 7 tons of coal per person per shift, was demanded without fail. Fail to meet it and your ration gets cut. And a reduced ration here, where the frost sucked the life from your bones, was tantamount to a slow death sentence. Today's day was no different from the previous ones. 12 hours underground. The muscles in his back and arms burned from the strain. Coal dust gritted between his teeth, clogged his nostrils, seeped into his skin so deeply that it could no longer be washed off. It had become part of him. Alexei worked silently, methodically, conserving every movement. He had learned this from the old convicts. Don't waste energy on anger. Don't burn yourself with hatred. Hatred was a luxury they couldn't afford here. It required energy, and all energy went into simply surviving. Suddenly, there was a dull crack, a sound every miner feared more than anything in the world. The support beam above Alexei's head ominously sagged. Fine stone rubble began to fall. "Back!" someone hoarsely shouted nearby. People scattered in all directions, but Alexei froze for a single moment. His engineer's gaze assessed the situation. The beam was holding on by a thread. A few more seconds and tons of rock would collapse. He jumped back at the last moment, and right where he had just stood, the ceiling crashed down with a deafening roar, raising a choking cloud of dust. For several minutes, everyone stood in stunned silence, coughing and spitting. Connor, a young sergeant with an indifferent face, lazily approached the rubble. "Everyone alive?" he asked without a trace of sympathy. "Then get to work, clear it. The quota won't fulfill itself." No one objected. Objections here were punished with the isolation cell. People silently picked up their shovels. It was at that moment, looking at the pile of rocks that had nearly become his grave, that Alexei felt something inside him finally break, or, conversely, forge itself anew. It wasn't anger, not fear. It was a cold, ringing emptiness, at the center of which a single thought ignited. Escape. The thought was insane. No one escapes from Vorkuta, around, for thousands of kilometers, tundra. In summer, swamps and mosquitoes. In winter, 40-degree frosts and blizzards that knock you off your feet. And everywhere patrols, posts, helicopters. Any fugitive was found within a few days, frozen, gnawed by wolves, or shot during apprehension. Stories of such escapes were passed by word of mouth like horror tales as warnings. The tundra is the best guard. The camp chief, Major Gromov, liked to repeat. But today, having nearly died under the collapse, Alexei understood a simple truth. Here, in the mine, a slow, guaranteed death awaited him. From unbearable labor, from scurvy, from an accident. Escape, however, offered a chance. 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000,000. But it was a chance for a different death, quick, in freedom, or for life. That evening, in the stinking, overcrowded barack. He lay on his bunk and stared at the soot-covered ceiling. Around him, exhausted bodies snored, coughed, moaned in their sleep. It smelled of Makorka tobacco, sour cabbage soup, and unwashed human sweat. Alexei closed his eyes and tried to remember his daughter Anya's face. When they took him away, she was only 5 years old. Now she should be 12. He hadn't seen her for 7 years, hadn't received letters for the last 3 years. His wife had apparently renounced the enemy of the people, and he could understand her. But the image of the little girl with 2 light braids was the only thing still connecting him to that other world. A world where there were bridges, Neva white nights, and a child's laughter. He had to try. For her, for the sake of at least dying knowing he had tried. His gaze fell on his hand. The skin was black, ingrained with coal dust. His nails were broken, but his engineer's fingers were still sensitive. He felt under the straw-stuffed mattress his only treasure, which he had hidden for several months. A small, rusty, but sharply honed nail on a stone. A tool, a weapon, a beginning. He clenched it in his fist so the point dug into his palm. The pain was sharp, alive. It sobered him. It reminded him that he was still alive. And as long as he was alive, he had this nail and the thought that now burned in his mind like a miner's lamp in the darkness. Escape at all costs. The next day, during roll call on the parade ground, the icy wind tore at the ragged quilted jacket from his shoulders. Major Grimoff, a short, stocky man with a heavy chin, surveyed the ranks with a heavy gaze. Yesterday on the 4th section, there was a collapse, he said in a flat, lifeless voice. No fatalities. That's good. Means no one will shirk work. But remember Article 58. He paused, savoring the effect. Your guilt before the motherland is so great that it can be redeemed only by honest labor or a quick death in an escape attempt. The choice is yours. Alexei stared straight ahead, at the barbed wire in several rows encircling the camp on the watchtower with sentries. Choice. For the first time in 7 years, he felt that he truly had a choice, and he had already made it. Now the hardest part remained. Turn the insane dream into a real plan and find someone willing to share this path to nowhere with him. His gaze slid over the rows of prisoners and stopped on the broad back of a man standing a few steps away. Fyodor, nicknamed Bear, a former frontline soldier, serving time for a fight with a party boss. A man who feared neither devil nor demon, the ideal partner or the one who would doom them both. Finding an ally in the camp was harder than finding gold in coal rock. Trust here was the scarcest currency. Every second person was an informer. Every first thought only of his own skin. Any careless word could turn into the isolation cell or a bullet to the back of the head. Alexei understood this like no one else. His own sentence was the result of someone else's betrayal. So he didn't rush. He observed. Fyodor, or Bear, was his complete opposite, huge, almost 2 meters tall, with broad shoulders and arms like sledgehammers. He was from a Siberian village, a former scout who had gone through the entire war. He ended up in the camp after crippling a district party secretary in a drunken brawl, who had tried to take the last sack of grain from his family. Fyodor wasn't a political. He was a man of the earth, a man of action. In him boiled a primal, untamed strength and the same primal hatred of injustice. In the mine, he worked like a machine, fulfilling double the quota and often helping those who were weaker. But his character was heavy, explosive. He could flare up over a trifle. And then even the guards feared him. Few interacted with him. Some out of fear, others out of contempt for his common crime article. But Alexei saw something more in him. He saw in those fierce eyes the same thirst for freedom that burned him. Only if in Alexei it was a cold, calculated flame, in Fyodor it was a raging fire. Alexei started small. Once, when Fyodor's pickaxe slipped from his hands and nearly fell into a deep crack, Alexei, standing nearby, deftly caught it. "Here, Bear," he said quietly, handing the tool. Fyodor gave him a heavy, suspicious look. "Thanks, engineer," he grumbled and turned away. That was the beginning. A few days later, in the dining hall, Alexei silently pushed his piece of bread to Fyodor. The ration had been cut for almost everyone that day. "You're big, you need it more," Alexei said, not looking at him. Fyodor looked at him from under his brows again, but took the bread and said nothing. The conversation happened only a week later, at night in the barack. Alexei lay with his eyes open, again and again turning over the details of the future plan in his head. "Can't sleep, engineer?" came a low whisper nearby. It was Fyodor. He lay on the adjacent bunk. "Thoughts are overwhelming," Alexei replied just as quietly. "About home, I bet, about women, about freedom." It slipped out of Alexei before he could think. Silence hung in the barack. Only the wind howling outside the wall could be heard. Alexei froze, cursing himself for his carelessness. "Freedom," Fyodor said slowly, as if tasting the word. "Is that the tundra? Swamps and mosquitoes. There's no freedom here, engineer. Here it's just wire and death on both sides." "There's death here too," Alexei objected. "Only it's slow and humiliating, and there at least the sky overhead is real." Fyodor was silent for a while, then propped himself up on his elbows and looked at Alexei in the dim light. "What do you want, intellectual? To hang yourself? I'll find you a rope. And if I've planned something, then speak straight or keep quiet forever." Alexei's heart pounded. This was the moment of truth. One wrong step and it was all over. "I want to leave here," he whispered, and those words sounded like a sentence. "East through the tundra. Reach the old believers' settlements by the Pechora. They say it's 200 kilometers from here." Fyodor chuckled, soundlessly but with his whole huge body.
200 chilometri.
"Do you even know what that is? These 200 kilometers here. It's eternity. It's death from cold on the 3rd day or hunger on the 5th. It's wolves that will follow your heels until you collapse. I've seen such smart guys. They find them in spring, or rather, what's left of them. But there's a chance," Alexei said stubbornly. "If we prepare, if we choose the right time. End of May, when the snow starts to melt, but the ground is still firm, and the rivers aren't open yet. We can walk on the ice. We need biscuits, lard, a knife, compass, and warm clothes. And where will you get all that, dreamer?" asked Gromov in his office. Fyodor's voice carried bitter irony. "Some things can be gotten, traded for rations, some stolen, clothes from the dead. Compass. Compass is the hardest, but I think over that you alone won't make it, Canada," Fyodor stated. "You'll break on the first day. You need someone who knows the tundra, who can track animals and hide from them." "I know," Alexei said quietly. "That's why I'm talking to you." Fyodor fell silent again. He stared into the darkness, and Alexei couldn't tell what he was thinking. Minutes passed, seeming like eternity. "All right," Bear finally said. "Suppose I believe you. Suppose I'm crazy and agree. Your plan. But there's no other anyway. But, mind you, engineer, one sideways glance, one wrong word in the wrong direction, and I'll rip your throat out myself before the screws can." "Understood. Understood," Alexei exhaled. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead. "Then listen." Fyodor's whisper became businesslike and harsh. "Biscuits are my concern. I work in the bakery once a week. I can pilfer a little at a time. Lard. Lard can be traded from the cook for makorka. Knife. A good knife is with Senka the crooked, the gambler. Can be won or taken by force. Clothes are harder. Need to wait for a corpse. And compass. I have one idea, but it's very dangerous." So began their conspiracy. By day, they were strangers to each other, barely exchanging a couple of words. At night, when the barack sank into sleep, they whispered details. Every step was a risk. Every hidden handful of biscuits, every piece of cloth stolen from the storeroom, could be their last. The atmosphere in the camp grew increasingly oppressive. Sergeant Rykov, a sadist and Gromov's favorite, as if sensing something, started picking on them for any reason. Once he stopped Fyodor at the dining hall exit. "Come on, Bear, empty your pockets. Your mug looks too well-fed." Fyodor's insides went cold. Under his jacket, he had several biscuits wrapped in a rag. Exposure meant the failure of the whole plan. He He slowly turned to Rykov, his fists clenched. Alexei, witnessing the scene, froze. Now Fyodor would snap, hit, and that would be the end. "What could I have there, Citizen Chief? Just camp dust and lice," Fyodor said deliberately calmly, unbuttoning his jacket. But at that moment, another guard ran across the parade ground. "Rykov, the major wants you. Urgently." Rykov spat viciously. "You're lucky, beast. Next time I'll strip you bare." He left. Fyodor slowly buttoned his jacket. He looked at Alexei, and in his eyes, Alexei saw not relief, but cold, calculated fury. The tension grew. They needed a knife. Senka the Crooked, a hardened criminal, would never part with his Finnish knife. Playing cards with him was suicide. He was a top-class cheat. "I'll take it from him," Fyodor said one night. "He'll stab you or rat you out," Alexei objected. "He won't have time. No, we mustn't leave traces. No violence inside the camp. Everything must be quiet. I have a better idea." A few days later, the camp had an unscheduled bath. The prisoners were herded naked into the icy anteroom to wait their turn. Clothes were piled in a common heap for delousing. Disinfection from lice. This was a chance. While Rykov and the other overseers laughed as they hosed the Zeks with cold water, Alexei, taking advantage of the chaos, stealthily made his way to the pile of clothes. He knew where Senka hid the knife. In the boot shaft, his fingers felt the heap of rags. Found the right boot. His hand slipped inside. There it was, the cold steel of the handle. He pulled out the Finnish knife and just as unnoticed slipped it into his own clothes lying nearby. But as he was returning to his place, he met Senka the Crooked's gaze. He was looking at him with narrow, snake-like eyes. He hadn't seen the theft itself, but suspected something. There was no threat in his gaze, just cold curiosity and understanding. In the barack after the bath, Senka approached Alexei's bunk. Fyodor tensed, ready to pounce. "I lost something, engineer," Senka said quietly, smirking crookedly. "A valuable item. Haven't found it." Alexei was silent, his heart sinking. "If you find it, pass it on," Senka continued, "to whoever needs it more. And tell them that Senka the Crooked doesn't forgive debts, but doesn't forget kindness either. Gromov, you see, isn't a friend to him either." He turned and left. Alexei and Fyodor exchanged glances. They couldn't tell if it was a trap or an unexpected blessing. That same evening, a sudden total search began in the barack. Shakedown. Guards burst in, led by Rykov. They overturned bunks, slashed mattresses, and shook out the pitiful belongings from bundles. "Search, boys, search," Rykov encouraged them. "Seems we've got rats here, planning to escape." Alexei felt the ground slip away. Their cache. A small depression in the earthen floor under the bunks, covered by a board, was too obvious. There lay the knife, biscuits, and a piece of lard traded by Fyodor. This was the end. Rykov was already approaching their bunks. With a contemptuous smirk, he kicked Alexei's bundle with his foot. "And what's here? Intelligentsia. Blueprints for a bright future." He bent down to lift the board. At the moment when Sergeant Rykov's hand reached for the board covering their cache, a piercing scream rang out from the far end of the barack, followed by a crash and the sound of breaking glass. Everyone turned. One of the prisoners, driven to despair by constant humiliations, in a fit of madness, smashed the only small window and tried to slit his throat with a shard. "Hold him!" Rykov roared, and all the guards, forgetting the search, rushed to the suicide. Chaos ensued. Shouts, scuffle. Taking advantage of this, Fyodor with a lightning movement grabbed everything from the cache and stuffed it under his jacket, while Alexei as unobtrusively as possible pushed the board back into place, covering it with dust and straw. A few minutes later, the bleeding unfortunate was dragged away. Rykov, angry and frustrated, once more swept the barack with a hateful gaze, but didn't continue the shakedown. "Disperse, you scum," he growled and stormed out. The danger had passed, but that night Alexei and Fyodor realized they had almost no time left. Rykov suspected something. There might not be a next time, They needed to act and act fast. The last, most important detail of their plan remained: a map. Without it, going into the tundra was suicide. And here, strangely enough, death helped them again. In the neighboring barack, in the infirmary, an old man everyone called the cartographer had been dying for several weeks. In his pre-war life, he was a geography professor, creating detailed maps of the North. He ended up in the camp back in the 30s and outlived all his judges. He was a living legend, a walking encyclopedia of these cursed places. His memory was phenomenal. They said he could draw a map of any region from the Urals to the Yenisei on the sand. Alexei started volunteering for work in the infirmary, cleaning, emptying bedpans, helping the paramedic. They allowed him. It was considered light work, but seeing suffering and death every day was hard. He began caring for the cartographer, bringing him an extra sip of water, adjusting his pillow, just sitting nearby when the old man raved, recalling his expeditions. Rivers, they're like veins on the hand of the earth, the cartographer whispered with parched lips. Find the main artery, and it will lead you to the heart, or away from it. Our Vorkuta, it's like a clot blocking the vein, but water always finds a way. Alexei listened, memorizing every word, every name. USA, Kalva, Pechora. These names sounded like music to him, like a promise. One night, when the old man got really bad, Alexei sat by his cot. The cartographer opened his eyes. His gaze was surprisingly clear. You're not here out of pity, engineer, he rasped. Alexei was silent. You want to escape? That wasn't a question, but a statement. I see it in your eyes. I had the same ones 30 years ago. I do, Alexei admitted honestly. The old man nodded weakly. Foolishness, but good foolishness. The right kind. Give me your hand. Alexei extended his hand. The cartographer took it with his thin, almost transparent fingers. Do you have skin? A piece or dense rag? Fyodor had prepared this in advance. He had traded a piece of old stiff leather the size of a palm from the shoemaker. Alexei pulled it from his pocket. Give it here, and a piece of charcoal. Alexei found a small charcoal in the stove. And then the magic began. With a trembling but steady hand, the old professor began drawing right on the piece of leather. It wasn't a map in the usual sense. It was a scheme of intertwined lines, crosses, and dots. Here's the camp, he whispered, pointing. From here, go strictly east. Not northeast, as everyone thinks, but strictly east. About 20 kilometers. There will be a ridge of hills. They call it Wolf's Crest. Cross over it. It will be hard going. Beyond the crest begins the hardest part. A swampy lowland. Don't go into it. Stick to the edge, keeping north. After about 3 days of travel, you should reach a stream. Small, unremarkable. It's not on any map. We called it Snaky. It flows into the Vorkuta River. Go upstream against the current. It's a detour, but safer. It will lead you to the upper reaches of the USA. And the USA, that's already the road to life. It flows into the Pechora. There, in the upper reaches, are the old believers' hermitages. They won't turn you in. Look for a cross carved on an old larch. That's their sign. He drew and spoke and drew. His voice grew quieter, and his hand moved slower. Finally, he finished. That's all I remember. Keep it safe. It might save your life. Now, give me water. Alexei brought him a mug. The old man took one sip and fell back on the pillow. His breathing became even and quiet. An hour later, he died. Alexei left the infirmary, clutching the priceless piece of leather in his fist. He felt not joy, but heaviness. This man had given him the last thing he had, his knowledge, his memory. And now Alexei simply had no right not to make it. The plan was ready. Map, knife, a small supply of food. They set the escape date, May 25th. By their calculations, it was the ideal time. The night was still long and dark enough, but the frosts weren't as severe. It remained to figure out how to get out of the camp. Climbing over the wire undercurrent was impossible. Digging a tunnel was nowhere and nothing. There was one way out, through the mine. The plan was bold and risky. During the night shift, they had to cause a small short circuit in the electrical network to turn off the lights in their section. In the ensuing chaos, slip into the old abandoned drift, which, according to rumors, surfaced several hundred meters outside the camp perimeter. This exit had long been considered collapsed, but Alexei, studying the old mine schematics he had glimpsed in the section chief's office, assumed the collapse might not be so complete. "This is madness," Fyodor said when he heard the plan. "We'll be buried there to hell, or suffocate from gas." "This is our only chance," Alexei replied firmly. "I've calculated the ventilation there is poor, of course, but if we move fast, we have about an hour before the air gets really bad. And I'm sure the collapse can be cleared. It doesn't look solid on the schematics." Fyodor was silent for a long time, looking at Alexei. "All right, engineer, lead. We're going to die anyway. Might as well not from the pickaxe." May 24th, the last day before the escape. The tension was almost physically palpable. Every word from a guard, every sidelong glance seemed a harbinger of failure. Alexei and Fyodor barely spoke, exchanging only brief looks. All their meager belongings, biscuits, lard, knife, and map, were securely hidden in a pre-prepared sack from a robe, which they planned to smuggle into the mine. In the evening, as their shift was led to work, the sky was covered with heavy leaden clouds. A strong wind rose, bringing not rain, but thick wet snow. A real blizzard began. "That's it," Fyodor whispered. "In this weather, we'll be buried 5 steps from the camp. All tracks will remain." Alexei looked at the snowflakes swirling in the spotlight beams. His plan was crumbling before his eyes. Such weather made escape impossible. Despair gripped his heart with an icy hand. But then he thought again. Blizzard, storm. On one hand, certain death in the tundra, on the other, perfect cover. In such weather, patrols sit in posts, helicopters don't fly, and tracks are covered in minutes. It was a terrible risk, but perhaps it was also the only chance fate was giving them. "No, Fyodor," he said just as quietly. "This isn't the end. This is the beginning. We're going today." They descended into the mine. The damp cold of the underground seemed almost warm after the icy wind above. They worked as always, but every movement was filled with new meaning. These were their last pickaxe strikes, their farewell to hell. At 2 a.m., when the shift was in full swing and the guards dozed at their posts, Alexei signaled Fyodor. He approached the distribution panel, holding a piece of wire he had hidden in advance. His heart pounded in his chest so hard it seemed audible throughout the mine. He closed his eyes and shorted the contacts. There was a loud pop, sparks flew, and their entire section plunged into pitch darkness. The darkness that fell upon them was absolute, primordial. Not like on a moonless night on the surface, but thick, viscous, and almost tangible. For a few seconds, complete silence reigned. Then the mine exploded with shouts, panic, curses, orders from the guards. In the light of their hand lanterns, shadows darted, creating chaos. "Stand in place. No panic," the shift chief's voice bellowed. This was their moment. "Follow me," Alexei whispered, grabbing Fyodor by the sleeve. They dove into a side passage away from the light and noise. They moved by feel, stumbling over rocks and rails of the narrow-gauge track. Alexei led. He had memorized the route from the schematic, counting turns. 50 steps straight, then right into the old shaft. There it was. At the entrance stood rotten wooden supports, smelling of dampness and decay. "This way," Alexei exhaled. They slipped through into a narrow burrow. With them was only the sack of supplies and one miner's lamp that Fyodor had managed to grab in the chaos. Its dim light snatched from the gloom slimy wet walls, dripping water and thick cobwebs. The air here was stale, heavy, smelling of rot and stagnant water. They moved deeper into the abandoned drift, walking fast, almost running. Alexei understood that soon the lights would be restored in the mine and roll call would begin. Their absence would be noticed in 10 minutes, no more, and then the pursuit would follow their tracks. "How much farther?" Fyodor asked hoarsely, breathing heavily. 300 meters, no more," Alexei replied, though he wasn't sure. The schematic was one thing, reality another. The drift went at a slight incline upward. Underfoot squelched icy water. A few minutes later, they hit what they feared most: the collapse. A pile of rocks, earth, and fragments of rotten beams completely blocked the passage. "We've arrived," Fyodor said grimly. Of course, but Alexei, shining the lamp, saw what he had hoped for. The collapse was old, settled, but the rocks weren't too large. And at the top, right under the ceiling, a small gap was visible, from which cold draft came. A barely audible whistle of wind seeped through. "No, look!" He pointed to the gap. "The exit is close, we need to clear it." They set to work. With bare hands, risking being buried alive, they dragged rocks, throwing them behind. The knife stolen from Senka the Crooked became their main tool. With it, they pried rocks and cut through rotten roots that had grown through the earth. The work was hellish. Air was catastrophically lacking.
His spoon.
Coal dust mixed with sweat streamed down their faces in black rivulets. It seemed like no less than an hour had passed, though in reality only 20 minutes. The gap grew larger. Now you could stick a hand through. Alexei did, and his fingers touched something soft and cold. "Snow, snow," he exhaled. "We're close." This gave them strength. They worked with doubled fury. Finally, the hole was big enough for a man to squeeze through. "Me first," Alexei said. "You climb after." He squeezed into the narrow opening, pushing off with his feet. Earth and small rocks fell down his collar. And there he was, free. The first breath of free air was like a blow. Icy, prickly, infused with the smell of wet snow and wind. It burned his lungs. Alexei tumbled out of the burrow into a snowdrift and for a few seconds was blinded by the whiteness. Around was night, but the snow reflected the dim light of low clouds, and everything seemed ghostly, gray-white. The blizzard raged. The wind howled like a hungry beast, throwing handfuls of stinging snow in the face. Following him, Fyodor climbed out. He stood to his full huge height, straightened his shoulders, and roared. It was an inhuman roar, the roar of a beast breaking out of a cage. In it was everything: joy, rage, and a challenge to this icy wilderness. "Freedom!" he bellowed through the howling wind. "Hear that, freedom?" "Quiet!" Alexei cut him off. "They might hear us. We need to go faster." They were only a few hundred meters from the camp fence. In the blizzard, the dim lights of spotlights on the towers were visible. It seemed impossible that there, just 500 steps away, their past slave life continued. They ran, sinking knee-deep in snow, stumbling, falling, and rising again. The wind hit their backs, pushing them, but at the same time knocking them down and sucking out the remnants of warmth. The clothes wet from underground water instantly began to cover with an icy crust. They ran east, as the old man's map indicated. They ran without looking back, without thoughts, obeying one instinct: get as far as possible before the alarm was raised. After an hour of frantic race, they stopped to catch their breath. The camp lights disappeared behind the wall of snow. Around was only white howling haze. They were alone, completely alone in the midst of the endless tundra. The feeling of freedom was intoxicating, but at the same time terrifying. They had escaped one prison only to enter another, much larger and perhaps even more deadly. We need to change clothes," Alexei said through chattering teeth. They found a small ravine that offered some protection from the wind. There, with hands trembling from cold and fatigue, they stripped off their wet camp robes and put on what they had managed to prepare: old but warm padded pants, quilted jackets, and hats taken from the dead. It was a pitiful semblance of normal clothing, but compared to what they had, true luxury. They ate one biscuit each, washing it down with snow. The food seemed divinely delicious. "Now where?" Fyodor asked, peering into the blizzard. Alexei pulled out his trump card. Compass. This had been the riskiest part of the preparation. He hadn't stolen or traded the compass. He made it himself. A few weeks before the escape, he managed to pilfer a magnetized plate and a piece of glass from the workshop. He begged a needle from the orderly under the pretext of sewing his robe. In the barack at night, risking being caught, He assembled a primitive device, a needle suspended on a thread in a small tin can covered with glass. It was inaccurate. The arrow wavered, but it pointed north. Strictly east, Alexei said, checking his homemade instrument and the old man's map. We need to reach Wolf's Crest by dawn. And they went. It was no longer a frantic race, but a slow, exhausting advance through the snowy vale. They walked in single file. Fyodor ahead, breaking a trail in the deep snow, Alexei behind, constantly checking the compass. The wind didn't subside. It seemed nature itself had turned against them. They walked for several hours, losing track of time. The world narrowed to a small circle before their eyes, to the crunch of snow underfoot and the howl of wind in their ears. Fatigue was leaden. The cold pierced to the bones despite the warm clothes. At some point, they came to a small river already covered with ice. We need to cross, Alexei said. According to the map, it flows from north to south. We need the other side. The ice might be thin, Fyodor said doubtfully. The blizzard just started. It might not be frozen through. No other way. Fyodor shrugged and stepped onto the ice first. He walked a few meters. The ice held. He waved to Alexei. Alexei stepped after, and then there was a sharp crack. The ice under Fyodor, who was almost twice as heavy as Alexei, gave way. With a cry, he went under the water. For a moment, only his head and desperately flailing arms appeared on the surface. Then the icy water closed over him. Alexei froze in horror. His partner, his only hope for survival in this wilderness, was drowning a few meters away. Around, no one, only white indifferent death. Panic, cold and sticky, paralyzed Alexei for a split second. He saw Fyodor desperately thrashing in the black ice hole, the icy water instantly stiffening his movements, turning the huge, strong man into a helpless kitten. The thought that now he would be left alone was more terrifying than the blizzard's howl. "Hand!" he shouted, overriding the wind. He lay on his stomach, spreading his arms and legs to distribute weight, and crawled to the edge of the hole. The ice cracked ominously but held. Fyodor surfaced again. His face was distorted from shock and cold. He no longer shouted, only rasped, choking on water. Alexei extended his hand. Their fingers touched for a moment, but Fyodor's glove, slippery from water, slipped away. The sack, Alexei realized. He quickly untied his sack, dumping the precious biscuits onto the ice, and holding one end, threw it to Fyodor. Gathering his last strength, he clutched it in a death grip. "Pull!" he rasped. Alexei braced his feet on the ice and pulled. He pulled with all his might, feeling every muscle strain, his face burning from the frost. Fyodor's huge, limp body wouldn't budge. He was like an anchor pulling him into the same icy grave. "Fedya! Come on, help!" Alexei shouted. Fyodor seemed to hear. He made a desperate effort, kicked against the ice edge and pulled himself up a bit. That was enough. Alexei jerked once more, and Fyodor's head and shoulders appeared above the water. Another jerk, and he, huge, wet, and completely lifeless, tumbled onto the ice. They were saved. But at what cost? Fyodor lay on the snow, unable to move. Violent shivers racked him. His teeth chattered like a machine gun. His clothes instantly turned into an icy armor. "Get up! We have to go, you'll freeze." Alexei shook him, but Fyodor only moaned. Alexei realized every second counted. He couldn't delay. He hoisted both sacks onto himself, grabbed Fyodor under the arm and almost dragged him along. Fyodor, stumbling and falling, somehow moved his legs. After a few hundred meters, when strength was nearly gone, luck smiled on them. They stumbled upon a life-saving island amid the white hell. Several old gnarled spruces huddled in a hollow. The wind here wasn't as strong. "That's it, halt!" Alexei exhaled, lowering Fyodor onto the snow under the cover of wide spruce branches. First, fire. Without fire, Fyodor was dead. With trembling, numb fingers, Alexei pulled out the knife. He shaved thin shavings from a dry trunk. He scraped resin and built a sort of shelter from branches. But how to ignite? They had no matches. This was the weakest part of their plan. Alexei had hoped for the old grandfather method of friction, but in their state it was impossible. And then he remembered. In the sack he had dumped on the ice was his homemade gadget. The compass in a tin can, covered with a piece of glass. Glass if the sun came out, but what sun in a blizzard? Despair rose in his throat again, and then it dawned on him. In the miner's lamp they had taken, there was still some carbide left and a flint for sparking. He smashed the lamp with a stone, carefully extracted the flint. One strike, second. On the third, the dry moss he had foresightly gathered in the mine and kept in his pocket smoldered. Alexei carefully blew on the weak spark, adding thin shavings. A few minutes later, seeming like eternity, a cheerful fire crackled. Warmth, divine, saving warmth. They were saved for the second time that hour. Alexei helped Fyodor strip off his soaking, icy clothes. His body was blue, covered in goosebumps. Alexei rubbed him with snow, then with his own dry clothes, risking freezing himself. He sat Fyodor as close to the fire as possible, wrapping him in all the rags they had. Half an hour later, Fyodor's shivering subsided. A faint blush appeared on his cheeks. He opened his eyes. "Thanks, engineer," he whispered. "I thought that was it." "Too early, bear," Alexei replied, though his own legs buckled from what they'd been through. "We still have to go on." They sat by the fire until dawn. The blizzard began to subside. The sky in the east lightened, painted in pale watercolor tones. They ate another biscuit each and set off. Fyodor was weak. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on a stick Alexei had carved for him. Every step was hard for him. Alexei carried both sacks. They had lost precious time. Now reaching Wolf's Crest by dawn was out of the question. Their tracks in the fresh snow were visible like the palm of a hand. And soon they heard what they feared. Distant, barely audible barking of dogs. Then a low, rumbling hum. "Helicopter! Down!" Alexei commanded. They fell into the snow next to some bushes. The helicopter flew quite high over them, circled, and flew toward the camp. They hadn't spotted them yet, but it meant the pursuit was in full swing. "They're following the trail," Fyodor said. "Dogs will be here soon." "I know. We need to confuse them." Alexei recalled stories from old hunters. They walked along the bed of a frozen stream, where there was less snow and the trail wasn't as clear. Then they walked long on a stony scree, where no tracks remained at all. This slowed them but gave hope. All day they walked at the limit of strength. The world turned into an endless white desert, where the only landmarks were the sun, Alexei's compass, and the distant ridge of hills on the horizon, Wolf's Crest. They barely spoke, conserving energy. Hunger became their constant companion. Biscuits didn't satisfy, only whetted the appetite. By evening, they finally reached the foot of the hills. The climb was steep and exhausting. Fyodor was completely weakened. He coughed, and the cough was dry and hacking. "I can't go on," he rasped, sinking onto the snow. "Leave me, engineer. Go alone. You'll have a chance at least." "Get up," Alexei said harshly. "I'm not leaving anyone. We left together. We'll make it together or die together." He hoisted Fyodor onto himself again and dragged him up. He didn't know where the strength came from. Probably that reserve that opens in a person on the brink of life and death. At the top of the crest, they collapsed exhausted, but the view that opened to them was worth all the torment. Below, as far as the eye could see, stretched a valley covered with forest. And somewhere far, far away, a silver thread snaked. A river. It was the USA, the road to life, but their joy was short-lived. Looking back, they saw what made their blood run cold. Far below, at the foot of the hills, along their trail moved small dark dots. For people and 2 dogs. The pursuit. They hadn't fallen behind. They were on their heels. "That's it," Fyodor said. "Now it's definitely the end. In the forest, they'll catch us quickly." Alexei thought feverishly. Running further was pointless. They were too exhausted. Needed to think of something. His gaze slid down the slope, and he saw what he was looking for. a small, almost unnoticeable scatter of rocks at the entrance to what could be a cave or crevice. "There!" he commanded. They rolled down the slope and found themselves at the entrance to a shallow cave, piled with snow. It was ideal cover, but simply hiding wasn't enough. They'd be found by tracks. "Fyodor, give me your padded jacket," Alexei said quickly. "And the rest of the food." Fyodor, not understanding, obeyed. Alexei took it, tied it to a stick, made something like a dummy. Then he walked from the cave another 100 meters along the slope, leaving clear tracks. He threw the dummy there and returned, stepping exactly in his own tracks. "What are you doing?" Fyodor asked. "False target," Alexei replied. "They'll see the tracks, see something dark on the snow, and think we tried to go further, but one of us fell exhausted. They'll go there. That'll give us some time." They huddled deep in the cave and blocked the entrance with snow, leaving only a small slit for observation, and waited. Time dragged agonizingly. They heard the dogs barking approaching. Then the pursuers themselves appeared. They stopped at the spot where the tracks turned to the cave. The dogs strained at the leashes, pulling toward them. Alexei's heart froze. Now they'd be discovered. But one of the guards, apparently the leader, looked further down the slope, saw the dark spot of the jacket, and waved there. There. They didn't check the cave and went along the false trail. A few minutes later, they disappeared behind a rock outcrop. Alexei and Fyodor exchanged glances. The plan worked, but they knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Soon the deception would be revealed, and the pursuers would return. "Now we need to go," Alexei whispered, "and as fast as possible." They climbed out of the cave and ran down into the saving forest. By night, they were deep in the taiga. They lit a small fire to warm up. Fyodor was getting worse. He burned with fever. His breathing was heavy and raspy. Pneumonia in these conditions, a death sentence. "I'm not leaving you," Alexei stubbornly repeated, covering him with his jacket. That night, he barely slept, tending the fire and listening to every rustle. Wolves howled around. Their howl was very close. They were following two weakened men, scenting easy prey. Suddenly, Alexei heard another sound, the crack of a branch. Very near. He grabbed the knife from his belt. A shadow appeared from behind the trees, a human figure. It slowly approached their fire. Alexei tensed, ready for a fight. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man in a ragged army coat, with an overgrown mad face and a rifle in his hands. He stopped a few steps from the fire and raised the rifle, aiming straight at Alexei. "Freeze!" the stranger rasped. "Don't move. This is my taiga." Alexei's heart plunged into the abyss. After the deadly race, icy water, and wolf howls, meeting here in the deep taiga, a man with a rifle was the last thing he expected. And this man clearly wasn't from the old believers. His eyes burned with a wild, mad fire, the kind that comes from people who have been alone too long. "We're not looking for trouble," Alexei said, slowly raising his hands. "We're just going our way. My comrade is sick. We need rest." "They all say that," the stranger smirked. The smirk revealed rotten teeth. "Then they steal supplies and slit throats at night. I know you, escapees from the 18th or Vorkuta Gulag." Alexei was silent. Any answer could be wrong. Silent? So I guessed right. I came from there too. 5 years ago, I left. He patted his rifle. "This is my freedom, and I'm not sharing it with anyone. Leave or I'll shoot you like dogs. I don't mind the bullets." Fyodor, lying by the fire, groaned in delirium. He thrashed, trying to throw off the jacket. "Fever. Water. He's dying," Alexei said quietly. "He needs help. Do you have a hut? Medicine?" "My hut. That's my hut." The hermit cut off. "And the best medicine for all ills is a bullet. So he doesn't suffer." He raised the rifle again, this time aiming at Fyodor. At that moment, something exploded in Alexei. All the fatigue, all the fear, all the despair of the last days merged into one clot of cold fury. He had gone through hell not for some forest madman to shoot his friend. "Don't you dare," he hissed, taking a step forward. "Stay where you are," the hermit squealed. His finger rested on the trigger. And then something no one expected happened. Fyodor, who seemed unconscious, sharply opened his eyes. There was no feverish delirium in them. There was pure animal rage. With one powerful, inhuman jerk, he jumped to his feet and lunged at the shooter. The hermit managed to fire. The shot's roar tore the night silence, startling a flock of crows from nearby trees. But Fyodor in his lunge knocked off his aim. The bullet whizzed away, and in the next second, the huge bear crashed down on the shooter with all his mass. They rolled in the snow, growling and trading blows. The rifle flew aside. Alexei rushed to it. It was an old rusty Burden rifle, but loaded. The fight was short and terrifying. The hermit was sinewy and agile. But against the primal power of Fyodor, maddened by illness and rage, he had no chance. Fyodor didn't fight. He killed. He grabbed his opponent's throat, and Alexei heard a gruesome gurgling rasp. "Fedya, enough!" Alexei shouted, running to them. "You'll kill him." But Fyodor didn't hear. He shook his victim like a rag doll. Alexei hit him with the rifle but on the back. Once, twice. Only after the third strong blow did Fyodor release his hands and collapse heavily onto the snow next to the lifeless body. Silence fell, dead, ringing. Alexei stood with the rifle in his hands over two bodies. One motionless, with a twisted neck and glazed eyes staring at the black sky. The other convulsing in a coughing fit, spewing clots of blood onto the white snow. Red berries on white snow. Alexei felt nausea rising in his throat. He had killed a man. No, not him, Fyodor. But it didn't matter. They had killed a man. A man who, like them, sought freedom and found only death. The price of their survival had just risen manifold. Now blood was on their hands. He knelt beside Fyodor. He breathed heavily with a rasp. I didn't mean to," Fyodor whispered. He wanted you. I know. Quiet. Save your strength." Alexei had to take everything into his own hands. He searched the dead man. In his pockets he found several cartridges, flint and tinder, and a small pouch of salt. Luxury. But mainly he found what he hoped for. Along a barely noticeable path leading from the fight site, after 200 meters, he came to a small, earth-sunken hut, the hermit's dwelling. It was a pitiful shack, built of logs and moss, but inside it was dry and almost warm. A potbelly stove, bunks covered with animal skins, a rough table, and mainly, a small supply of food, dried meat, a sack of flour and dried mushrooms, and some herbs hanging from the ceiling. Alexei returned for Fyodor. Carrying him alone was incredibly hard. He fashioned a sort of drag from spruce branches and for several hours dragged his friend's unconscious body to the saving shelter. He covered the dead man's body with snow and branches. He couldn't force himself to just leave it for the wolves. The next few days turned for Alexei into an endless struggle for Fyodor's life. He wasn't a doctor, but he was an engineer. He approached the problem methodically. He stoked the stove, gave Fyodor hot decoction from some berries he found in the hut, hoping it wasn't poison. He rubbed him with salt to warm him. He cooked thin gruel from flour and dried meat and spooned it into Fyodor's mouth. Fyodor thrashed in delirium. He shouted, called for his mother, gave orders in German, apparently recalling his scout service. Alexei sat nearby, changing the wet rag on his forehead and talking to him. About anything, bridges in Leningrad, his daughter, the stars. He didn't know if Fyodor heard him, but it seemed the sound of a human voice should help. These were the most terrifying days. Alexei was on the verge of complete exhaustion. He slept in snatches of an hour or so, constantly listening to his friend's breathing and sounds outside. It seemed any moment the pursuit would burst through the door or the ghost of the killed hermit would return. He barely ate, giving everything to Fyodor. One day he went out to fetch snow. The taiga stood quiet, snow-covered, majestically indifferent, and in this silence, Alexei felt such crushing loneliness that he wanted to lie in the snow and not get up. Everything seemed pointless. Their escape, the struggle, the stranger's death. He was just a tiny grain of sand in this icy world. and this world was slowly but surely grinding him down. He sat on a fallen tree and covered his face with his hands. For the first time in all the years of imprisonment and escape, he cried soundlessly, bitterly, shaking with his whole body. He didn't know how long he sat like that, but when he raised his head, he saw rare large snowflakes falling from the sky, and one landed on his hand and didn't melt. It was perfectly symmetrical, like a tiny star. He looked at it and suddenly remembered how his little daughter Anya caught snowflakes on her mitten and rejoiced at their beauty. And this thought, this image from another, almost forgotten life, suddenly returned his strength. He had no right to give up, not here, not now. He must make it. He must find out what became of her. He returned to the hut with new resolve. On the 5th day, the crisis passed. At night, Fyodor stopped thrashing. His breathing became even, deep. In the morning, he opened his eyes and looked at Alexei meaningfully. Where are we?" he rasped. "We survived, Bear," Alexei said, a faint smile on his face. "We survived." Fyodor was still very weak, but he would live. They had defeated death, illness, pursuit. But the price of this victory was horrific. The killed man's rifle stood in the corner, and every time Alexei's gaze fell on it, he saw the hermit's glazed eyes before him. This memory would now stay with him forever. He was free from the camp, but enslaved by his own conscience. They stayed in the hut another week. Fyodor slowly regained strength. Alexei hunted. He was lucky to shoot a hare. For the first time in a long while, they ate fresh meat. They restored strength, healed wounds, both physical and spiritual. But they knew they couldn't stay here long. The pursuit could stumble upon the hut any moment. "Time to go," Fyodor said one day, rising to his feet on his own for the first time. "Time," Alexei agreed. He pulled out his map, drawn on the piece of leather. It was frayed, wet, but the lines drawn by the dead cartographer's hand were still visible. To the USA, no more than 30 kilometers left. "If we believe him." "I believe him," Fyodor said. They gathered their meager belongings, took the rifle, cartridges, and remaining food. Before leaving, Alexei stopped at the threshold. He looked at the bunks where his friend had died and risen, at the cooled stove, at the table where they shared their first normal meal in years. This place had become for them both a site of crime and salvation. "Thank you," he said quietly into the void and closed the door behind him. They stepped again into the white silence. But now they were different, no longer just escaped convicts, but two men who had passed through death and paid for their lives with another's. The path to the USA proved harder than they anticipated. The taiga, which from the top of Wolf's Crest seemed a saving forest, was in fact a treacherous trap. Deep snow hid deadfalls and frozen bogs. Several times they sank waist-deep in snowy mush, got wet again. Fyodor was still weak, and every kilometer was enormously hard for them. Alexei went ahead, orienting by compass and sun. The cartographer's map became sacred text for him. He checked it every hour, fearing to stray. He learned to read the forest, noticed broken branches, animal tracks, determined directions by moss on trees. The bridge-building engineer was dying in him, giving way to a taiga man, a man of nature. He no longer fought it. He tried to become part of it to survive. On the 3rd day after leaving the hut, their food ran out. Hunger, their main enemy. It wasn't as sharp as in the first days, but dull, aching, sucking out the last strength. The rifle was their only hope, but game seemed extinct. They saw no hares, no birds. "The taiga is laughing at us," Fyodor rasped. "Evening by a weak campfire. Let us survive to starve us now." Alexei was silent. He whittled a stick with the knife, turning it into a semblance of a hook. "What are you doing?" Fyodor asked. "Tomorrow we should reach the river," Alexei said. "If the old man wasn't wrong, we'll fish." "With what?" "A stick." Fyodor smirked. Alexei didn't answer. He pulled from his bosom what he guarded like the apple of his eye, his ear-flap hat. He ripped the lining and unraveled it into thin but strong threads. "This will be the line. And bait. Bait will have to be us." The next day by noon, they heard a new sound. Not the wind's howl, not branch cracks, but a faint but constant hum. Water, Alexei whispered. They quickened pace, and soon the forest parted. Before them, wide and majestic, flowed the river's dark waters, almost free of ice. Only at the shore's wide edges remained. This was the USA. They stood on a high bank, gazing at the powerful current. This river was their goal, their road to salvation, but now it seemed an insurmountable barrier. How do we cross it? Fyodor asked. We don't need to cross it, Alexei replied, checking the map. We need upstream, 100 kilometers. Somewhere there should be hermitages. They went along the bank. Walking became easier, but hunger drove them mad. In the evening, Alexei started fishing. He tied his homemade line to a long stick, hooked a piece of leather cut from a boot onto the splinter hook, and cast his rod into the water. Fyodor watched him doubtfully. They sat in silence for several hours. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in crimson tones. Nothing. Give up, engineer, Fyodor said. It won't work. Let's go look for roots. Some kind. And at that moment, the stick in Alexei's hands jerked so hard he barely held it. Got one, he shouted. He carefully pulled. The line tautened like a string. The struggle was short. A minute later, he hauled a large silvery fish ashore. It was a grayling, about 2 kilograms. They looked at the fish like a miracle. Fyodor even crossed himself. That evening they had a feast. They baked the fish on coals, and never in his life had Alexei eaten anything tastier. This fish wasn't just food. It was a sign that the taiga had taken pity on them. Inspired by success, they moved on with new strength. They walked another 4 days. Every day Alexei caught fish and they didn't starve. Fyodor fully recovered. He even began joking, recalling his frontline tales. But Alexei remained serious and focused. He couldn't relax, not until they reached the goal. And then one day they saw it. On a high bank, on an old mighty larch, a cross was carved. A simple 8-pointed Orthodox cross. The sign the cartographer had spoken of. They had found it. They had made it. From the cross, a barely noticeable path led deep into the forest. They followed it. Half an hour later, they came to a clearing. On the clearing stood several log cabins, sturdy, solid. Smoke curled from the chimney of one. Nearby was a small chapel with a tilted cross on the dome. This was an old believer hermitage. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, not daring to go further. What awaited them? How would these people, who had hidden from the world for centuries, receive them? From the hut came a tall, bearded old man in a long, dark shirt. He saw them and stopped. He looked long at the 2 ragged, overgrown men with a rifle. There was no fear or surprise in his gaze, only calm, deep curiosity. Alexei took a step forward. "Peace to your house," he said, bowing. It was a phrase he had read once in books. The old man didn't answer. He silently looked at them. Then his gaze stopped on their exhausted faces, on the torn clothes, on the expression in their eyes. Fleeing from the world or chasing the world? He finally asked in a low, thick voice. "Fleeing from trouble, father?" Alexei replied. "From captivity." The old man slowly nodded. "Trouble finds man everywhere, in the world and in the hermitage, but captivity sits in the heart, not behind wire. Well, all right. I see you're exhausted, people. Come into the hut. The bath is heating, and then we'll sit at the table." God sent guests. This was a moment of absolute and real happiness. They were accepted, without extra questions, without suspicions. These people, themselves persecuted and hunted, saw in them not escaped convicts, but simply people in trouble. They were fed cabbage soup, porridge, given hot herbal tea. In the bath, for the first time in many weeks, they washed off all the dirt. Camp, taiga, road. With the dirt went part of that inhuman fatigue accumulated in their bodies. In the evening, they sat in the main room, lit by a splinter's light. The old man was called Father Celenti. He was the mentor of this small community. Besides him, 3 families lived here. Total 12 people, including children. They lived by the laws of their ancestors in complete isolation from the Soviet world, which they considered the kingdom of the Antichrist. "We don't ask who you are or where from," Selenty said, looking at Alexei with his clear, piercing eyes. "We care not for worldly laws. We have one law, God's. Feed, warm, shelter a person in trouble. Stay as long as needed. There's room. Work too." "Thank you, Father," Alexei said quietly. He wanted to cry from gratitude. "Your rifle," Selenty suddenly said, nodding at the burden in the corner. "Smells of fresh blood." Alexei flinched. Fyodor tensed. "Don't fear," the old man sighed. "You're not the first, not the last. The taiga is strict. Either you or it gets you. Sin, of course, mortal, but the Lord is merciful. You'll have to pray it off. Long." He rose, went to the icon in the corner, and lit a candle before it. "Rest, travelers. Your road was long." Alexei and Fyodor stayed in the hermitage. They lived there all summer and autumn. They worked with everyone, felling timber, mowing hay, catching fish, preparing for the long winter. Fyodor, with his peasant grip and strength, fit right in here. He seemed to return to his native element. He was silent a lot, but his eyes no longer held that animal fury. It was replaced by quiet, deep sorrow. He often went to the chapel and stood long before the icons. Alexei worked too. His engineering skills came in handy. He helped repair the water mill built by Selenty's grandfather. But his soul was restless. He was grateful to these people. He respected their faith and way of life. But he was a stranger here. His world was there, beyond forests and swamps in Leningrad. Somewhere there lived his daughter. He often thought of her. What had become of her? Did she remember him? He must let her know he was alive. But how? Any attempt to contact the outside world could lead the pursuit here to these people who saved him. He had no right to expose them. This was a new cage, not of barbed wire, but of debt and gratitude. He escaped one captivity to enter another, no less strong. Winter came early and immediately took power. It buried the taiga in deep snows, froze rivers with thick ice, and set crackling 40-degree frosts. Life in the hermitage froze, retreated inside warm huts. For Alexei, this was a time of long reflections. Sitting by the stove and gazing at the fire, he again and again replayed everything that had happened. Escape, the hermit's death, salvation. What next? He looked at Fyodor. He had changed greatly. The harsh, unsociable bear became a quiet believer. He found here what he lacked all his life: peace. He grew close to Father Selenty, talked a lot with him about faith, sins, forgiveness. It seemed he was ready to stay in this lost world forever. "You're not like me, engineer," Fyodor said to him once when they sat alone. "The taiga doesn't hold you. The city calls you. Your soul stayed there." "My daughter is there," Alexei simply replied. "I must at least know if she's alive." "I know. And you'll go as soon as spring comes." "And you?" Alexei asked. Fyodor was silent, looking out the window at the snow-covered spruces. "And I seems have walked my path. I'll stay here. Here is my sin. Here I'll pray it off. Maybe the Lord will forgive the old fool." This conversation was a turning point for Alexei. He realized Fyodor was right. He couldn't live here. His freedom wasn't in the taiga wilderness, but in the possibility to return to his past life, or at least try. In spring, when the rivers opened, Father Selenty approached him himself. "Gathering, Alexei?" he asked. "Gathering, Father. Your business. We won't hold by force. Here once a year on high water comes a hunter from the Pechora, trades us salt, powder for furs." Reliable man, silent. "He'll go down the river to Naryanmar. Maybe he'll take you." "Isn't it dangerous for you?" Alexei asked. "He might talk. Ivan won't say an extra word." "And what to say?" "Saw a man at Selenty's, who knows who visits me." 2 weeks later, Ivan arrived, a middle-aged stocky Komi hunter in a big boat. He indeed asked no extra questions. Looked at Alexei, at Selenty blessing him, nodded and said, Sit, there's room. Farewell with Fyodor was short. They simply hugged. Take care, engineer, Fyodor said. And you, Bear, thank you for everything. Thank you. You saved my life. Twice they looked into each other's eyes, and in that gaze was everything. The hell endured together, the blood, the salvation. No more words were needed. The river journey took almost 3 weeks. They floated in silence. Ivan proved an ideal companion. He didn't pry, but shared food and cared for Alexei in his own way. In Naryanmar, he simply dropped him on the shore, gave some money and said, "Further on your own and don't mention my name, or mine." Alexei was left alone in the port city. Noise, people, machines. All this after a year in the taiga, stunned and frightened. He looked like a ghost from another world, ragged, with a wild gaze, without documents. Any patrol could arrest him any minute. He spent the money Ivan gave on the cheapest clothes at the market, and a ticket on a steamer to Arkhangelsk. There he scraped by for several weeks with odd jobs in the port, unloading fish, slept wherever. Every day he bought Pravda newspaper, Pravda of the North newspaper, and searched for any mentions of an escape from Vorkuta. Nothing. Either they had long stopped searching, writing them off as wolf food, or the information was classified. His main problem was documents. Without them, he was nobody, and here chance helped again. In one of the port flophouses, he chatted with an old sailor, a drunken former navigator. For a bottle of vodka, he told him about a man who could make any papers. It was a huge risk. This man could be an informer, but there was no other way. The meeting happened in a dirty dive on the city outskirts. The forger was a small, nimble little man with shifty eyes. He scrutinized Alexei long. "Your face is memorable," he said. "With history, it'll cost dear." Alexei gave him all he earned. A week later, he got a passport in the name of Nikolai Vasilyevich Simayanov, native of a village near Vologda. The photo was blurry, the stamps crooked, but for a not too picky militiaman, it might pass. Now he was Nikolai Simayanov. Alexei Vornov, engineer from Leningrad, died in the Vorkuta mine, and Nikolai Simayanov bought a train ticket to Leningrad. The whole way he didn't sleep. He looked out the window, and his heart clenched from fear and hope. What he would see there. Would he recognize his city? Would they recognize him? There it was, Leningrad. He stepped onto the platform of Vitebsky station and froze for a moment. The same noise, the same bustle, but everything seemed different, alien. He walked streets he knew by heart and felt like a foreigner. He reached his old house on the Petrograd side, looked at the windows of his apartment on the 3rd floor. Light burned in them. Shadows moved behind the curtains. Other people lived there. He sat on a bench in the square opposite. What to do next? Knock on the door. Ask where his wife and daughter were. And what would he tell them? "Hello. I'm your husband and father, whom you haven't seen for 8 years. I'm an enemy of the people, escaped from hard labor." He would ruin them with his mere appearance. He sat on the bench until deep night and made the hardest decision of his life. He wouldn't search for them. His freedom, bought at such a terrible price, must not become a curse for them. He must disappear forever. The next day he left Leningrad. He went south to a small steppe town where no one knew him, got a job on a construction site. He was simply Nikolai Simayanov, a silent, unsociable man with a heavy gaze. Years passed, he never married. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts. Sometimes at night he dreamed of the Vorkuta mine, the white haze of the tundra, and the glazed eyes of the killed hermit. Then he woke in cold sweat and couldn't sleep for long. Once, already a gray-haired old man, in 1985, he read a small note in the newspaper. In Leningrad, at a young architect's competition, first prize was awarded to one Anna Alexeyevna Vornova for a project of a new bridge over the Malaya Nevka. The note had her photo, a young, beautiful woman with his eyes. He looked long at this photo. His daughter. She became an architect, builds bridges like he once did. So it all wasn't in vain. His sacrifice, his sufferings, his escape, all this had meaning. He cut out the note and put it in his old passport in the name of Nikolai Simayanov. This was his only link to the past, his only reward. He left the house and looked at the sky. He was free. But what is freedom? It's not just the absence of bars and barbed wire. It's something more. And to the end of his life, he couldn't give himself a final answer to this question. Was his freedom a victory or just another form of life imprisonment, where the prison was his memories and the guard his conscience? He didn't know, he just lived. A free man, forever having lost his name, his family, and his soul somewhere there, in the eternal permafrost of Siberia.